Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. The last few years have seen a huge growth in independent Welsh media. While long-standing structural issues about Wales's representation in UK-wide media remain, concerns over the absence of dedicated Welsh news and current affairs coverage have led to claims that in Wales we have a democratic deficit, an issue brought into sharp relief during the events of 2020. Tonight we are joined by Welsh media professionals from both ends of the M4 to discuss what can be done to improve our domestic media and how to address how we're portrayed in the UK media. Joining me and Kerry this evening, we have Martin Shipton, political editor-at-large at the Western Mail. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Matt. Good to be here.
We have Hugh Marshall, former head of digital at SLC and founder of the News.Wales. Hi, Hugh.
Hello, how are you?
We also have Rhian E. Jones, who's co-editor of the Red Pepper magazine and a contributor at the Tribune. Hi, Rhian.
Hi, Matthew. Thanks for the invite.
Well, thank you very much for all being here. The first question I wanted to ask is, what is the state of the Welsh media and representation of Wales in the UK media? Martin, do you want to start with that?
I mean, I, of course, come from quite a traditional newspaper background. I've also been heavily involved with the NUJ for many years. And I suppose my approach has always been twofold. As a journalist, I'm very keen to see proper coverage of news events and politics in Wales. And as a union activist, I'm anxious that there should be as many jobs available as possible for the people who go through journalistic training. Now, what has happened over the last nearly 20 years is a huge reduction in the number of journalists who have been working in Wales in traditional media. And that's as a result of the fact that when the internet came along, newspaper owners didn't have a plan about monetization of whatever they were going to be doing online. And they just sort of like lemmings went over the cliff and said, right, this internet's a great thing, let's get involved in this, without actually having a business model at all. What has happened as a result of this is that they're all geared up to spend quite a lot of money investing in the equipment which is needed and investing in the staff to do digital journalism, but they're not actually making a great deal of money out of it. I mean, a very stark statistic that I can provide is that for Reach PLC in 2019, it was still the case that 84% of the revenue came from print. So the challenge which these newspaper companies are faced with is making up the lost revenue from print with new revenue from digital. But they've become, in my view, completely obsessed with digital to the point where they're constantly telling their staff how many page views they've got. They're introducing targets that they give to reporters about how many page views they want their stories to get. This creates a very difficult situation, in my view, from the point of view of those of us who are interested in public interest journalism, because it means that a lot of the people who are working for these websites are now actually producing stories about Greg's pasties, about Wetherspoon's latest menus, things like that, material which we would not regard as public interest journalism. So public interest journalism is really up against it. I'm very pleased that after this recent redundancy program at Reach, who of course are by far and away the biggest newspaper proprietors in Wales, they have protected a degree the Western Mail, because the Western Mail, in my view, and obviously I'm prejudiced because I work for it, I think is a good publication. It's got a lot of coverage of serious issues. It's been extremely good on the coronavirus. The paper is providing a good service. It's just a shame that a lot of the material that goes into the Western Mail does not actually go on Wales Online, because Reach do not consider that the type of more serious material which goes into the Western Mail is going to get the number of page views that it wants. So this provides a huge challenge. If we look beyond Reach, we're looking at a situation where there are an increasing number of people who are making a good contribution, but very often these are operations that are employing very small numbers of people. Even some of the well-known ones, the individuals concerned would not be able to make a living out of them. I was very fortunate many years ago to do a journalism course, got a full-time job, had a career in it. That's what I want to see for people now. People need to have money. And I think, we are reaching a stage where, the Welsh government is going to have to think in terms of what they can do in terms of public funding. And also, of course, I would be very keen to tax these big media players like Facebook and Google, who are parasitical organizations who make their money out of piggybacking on work that is done for people who want to use their channels.
Well, Hugh, I'm sure, has got some views on building a revenue stream, or at least getting funding for those platforms in Wales. But what do you think the state of the Welsh media is, Hugh, and how are you using the News.Wales to tackle what you see are the problems with it?
Yeah, I agree with lots of what Martin said, although I think, ironically, Reach published their annual profits of £135 million today. Maybe tweets about Greg's pasties pays. I think, obviously the main problem we have here is the lack of maturity of our own sort of domestic news platforms. If you look at something like Scotland, they've had for a long time genuine Scottish titles, the titles that only exist in Scotland, but things like The Sun, The Mirror, they're all genuinely Scottish titles up there. Whereas in Wales, I know people like The Mirror dabbled for a bit with the Welsh Mirror. The Times does at weekends has a Welsh insert. But just the fact that we don't have a national service, and it's not having a go at Reach, but the fact that they have the Daily Post and the Western Mail, they've actually created a split in Wales of having two titles that somehow compete with each other. So Daily Post, where I grew up in Wrexham, Daily Post was the paper we read there on a daily basis. And then having moved south, you'd never see the Daily Post. It was the Western Mail. So the fact that we've never really had a national print title, BBC have got the digital coverage, national digital coverage, and it's very well resourced. Ironically, BBC Cymru View, the Welsh language service, isn't mirrored in English. BBC Cymru View is a far better service in the Welsh language as a rolling news service with articles and blogs and other content in there. But for some reason, the English version of the BBC website is basically, a subset of the UK situation. And I think it's just the fact that we know, the research that comes out, every year, the Daily Mail and the Sun are the two most popular newspapers. The Metro was, obviously, they've taken a hammering because, most people got the Metro on the train and on the buses, and because of COVID, that's had an impact. And the fact that people listen to their news, the majority of it does come from a UK perspective. So, Radio 2 is the most popular radio station in Wales. So it is a problem because people have been conditioned for years of having their news, which is basically coming from London, and that news hasn't kept up with devolution. And I think that's what we found. It's taken something like COVID to actually make devolution obvious to people. I think if you did survey now, I think it was like a year or two ago, 60% of people in Wales didn't know that the NHS in Wales was run by, the Welsh government, and Vaughan Gething was the health minister. I would imagine that figure has changed quite substantially in the last year. In Wales, we seem to be part of a traditionally British media world. We've got one radio channel in English, one radio channel in Welsh. We've got some independent radio stations. So we lack that maturity and plurality. That's the challenge. And I think what we're trying to do with the News Wales, which is a pilot phase, we'll be launching, a staffed service, hopefully 1st of March, under a new brand. And when the brand is revealed, all will become clear. But we're doing it on a subscription basis because we know now that has to be the model moving forward. You need to have people who are willing to pay, on that monthly basis, put money in, and we can sort of make, genuine promises to people. Well, if we reach X number of subscribers, then we can appoint a content editor in this area. But our focus when we launch will be on politics and news and explaining more about what's going on, because I think that's the problem as well, is with devolution, is people still don't understand it. Compared with Scotland, I think they're far further down the road of understanding devolution, whereas in Wales, I think people still not understanding what devolution means. So that's what we're going to be trying to do.
Rhian, what is your view on sort of how Wales is represented in the UK media? Do you think that we get a good coverage, and do you think that reflects back on a sort of the weakness of our own Indigenous media here in Wales, that the coverage is the way it is?
I agree that I think the coverage is reflective of the state of the Welsh public sphere or the Welsh polity perhaps as a whole, but that's something that I would like to see change in the same way that I'd like to see coverage of Wales at a national level changing. My perspective, I guess, is that of someone who, I come from Wales, I live and work in London, but I still regard myself as Welsh, and I'm still very personally and politically interested in Wales. So I find the lack of UK-wide attention to Wales quite frustrating at times. The way I tend to see Wales represented, if at all, is that it becomes significant or interesting when it becomes disruptive, when it becomes inconvenient for UK politics. I think I'll talk about the pandemic response in a bit, but I think Brexit was actually a significant example of this, the kind of the surprise and upset that Wales had narrowly voted leave, in the same way that you got sort of investigations into other post-industrial bits of England. There were also, sort of quite cringily sometimes, like Guardian journalists coming down to the Welsh valleys and acting as though they were on safari and that kind of thing, rather than, actually platforming voices from those areas or looking at Welsh media itself to see if they could explain the politics. So I think sort of, internal Welsh voices should be platformed more, and rather than Wales being treated as a sort of an afterthought or sometimes a curiosity in the way that it is. I think there's similar political examples, like the prospect of Labour losing electoral control in Wales, in the same way that that Scotland became an issue prior to that. But you rarely see coverage or representation of Wales then for its own sake. The response to COVID-19 has lessened that, and as Hugh was saying, like there were things like the coverage of the firebreak in November, which was initially quite hostile and quite sort of scaremongering about Drakeford imposing a tyranny of rolling lockdowns on the country. But then, that in some ways our policy turned out to be more sensible than policy in England did. So I have noticed very recently that the four constituent parts of the UK are now being treated as discrete entities in terms of their lockdown policies. Although you still see Scotland getting more attention than Wales, I think. Like Nicola Sturgeon's briefings tend to be made more of than Drakeford's do. So there's still that disparity.
We're obviously coming at it from a very political point of view, and this year's an important election year. And there's been a lot being said around the political media deficit in Wales. And would you say that there is that deficit of political coverage in Wales, and that hits our kind of political institutions in a way that other parts of the UK don't have?
I would agree. I think this point has been made for quite a long time without any action being taken on it. I was actually looking at an NUJ report from 2014 that had Rosemary Butler, who is the Assembly as it was then, presiding officer, saying that Wales is sleepwalking towards a situation where there'll be no coverage of the work of the Assembly at all. And she attributed a lot of that to mainstream, like Fleet Street newspapers not covering the Assembly. And I think the response to that report from English journalists was just that, well, the Welsh political meetings are incredibly boring, and that's not going to change. So you have that sort of attitude to contend with from the UK press. But I think there's also issues with Welsh political coverage itself. There's problems of resources and of access. So I think there's structural issues there to address, as well as the inclination to report on Wales. And I guess I think that in terms of like Welsh specific media, I think things like Nation Cymru and Voice Wales as well, sort of new media sites, the fact that they are growing and expanding is a good indication that there is a market for coverage of Welsh politics and culture. And I think a lot of their report on is sort of local grassroots reporting. Like it's not actually Senedd politics, it's local community issues. So I think there's a point there about when we think about political coverage, we need to go beyond a sort of technocratic layer or institutional politics and look at communities and individuals.
Yeah, again, I agree with what's been said. I think there is an issue about holding government to account. One of the issues we have is a lot of news currently is literally just reporting stuff, so just saying what's happening and not actually going deeper and asking questions about what is claimed and said. And that's something that we want to look at, and also just the fact of the type of content that's being created, especially younger audiences now, because remember, we've got 16, 17-year-olds voting at the Senate elections, and in the run up to the election, I think it's really important that people get to understand what those policies are, but also, are they realistic? Can they be fact checked to see whether somebody's making claims? I think it was interesting, the leader of the Abolish Assembly, wherever, was on in Politics Wales on Sunday, and made the point of the people, if they get the facts, that's what they need, not opinion polls. And the fact that he came out with was that Wales had the third highest death rate from COVID in the world, which was false. That was pre-recorded, so that could have been verified, checked, and actually put on there saying, well, actually, no, he's just making stuff up. And I think that's the trouble is, and especially now, we've seen in America, there's so much lying going on, and there's not enough challenging of these lies. And because people can lie, that's what they do. They just realise, no, we can just say anything. I think in Wales, from the main political parties, I think generally, they are quite good. Unfortunately, there's a few outsiders within some parties who caught controversy on social media, for example. And again, that kind of stuff needs challenging. I think, it's just a case of taking somebody's word on it. So I think that's something we're looking at as politics, but also it's how you actually explain stuff that's going on and how things work. Because people, generally aren't aware of committees. They don't know what committees do. When they talk about increasing the number of AMs and the need, because of extra legislation, means there's more scrutiny, and that's what that's the reason why you need to expand the numbers. It's nothing to do with gravy trains. It's a fact of good politics to be able to scrutinise and challenge the work of government. But that isn't explained to people. So how do we do that in styles and manners, using video and audio, putting faces to people as well? Because again, people don't know who these politicians are. I go through the list of Senate members, and there are some in there on the back benches. Literally they've been there, some of them, for 15 years. I've never even heard them speak. So again, I think that there's a role there just to raise awareness of what's going on in Wales.
If we look at the situation from a local point of view, there has been something of an improvement over the last couple of years since there was this local democracy reporter initiative from the BBC. I mean, you've had situations which had arisen where a number of local authorities across Wales who were no longer covered by journalists at all, which was a shocking state of affairs. And that, of course, inevitably leads to complacency on the part of the elected councillors. It also means that the chances of irregularities taking place has increased. There are many people who criticise the fact that this local democracy reporter network was established, because clearly it's funded by the BBC, and that means it takes money away from their core function. But it has been of use, because a lot of the reporters who have been employed, I would say, have been pretty assiduous in the jobs that they have done, and they have reported significant stories that otherwise perhaps would not have been reported. So it's just a shame that they had to step in to do work which ought to have been done by the core news operators themselves. That's the difficulty. But I mean, I do know that one of the problems was that a lot of these local papers, there were local papers that existed which closed down, creating this democratic deficit on a local basis. And local papers were the lifeblood of communities. And 20 years ago, the Celtic series of weekly papers in the valleys, for example, were very well read. And I mean, I've spoken to councillors and former councillors who would say that they would look forward to reading those papers to find out what was being said about what they had been getting up to, and that there was an enormous amount of public response to what they were doing and what was being said about them. That all went pear-shaped because the newspapers, because their profits were going down, were effectively amalgamating some of these titles, and that took them away from their communities. And it got to a point there was a lot of copy sharing that was going on. Local reporting had devalued to the point where reporters were not going to council meetings to see the ding-dong that was going on, to find out about conflicts that were taking place between the political parties or whatever. But instead, they were filling space that previously had been proper news reports with press releases from the council. So the council would be putting out stuff which was positive to them. And a whole load of material just wasn't getting covered. As I say, that situation has been mitigated by this local democracy reporter situation. Now, so far as national political coverage in Wales is concerned, and I'm trying to be as dispassionate as I possibly can be about this, I do think the Western Mail is a very good newspaper. There is a lot of very good material in there. The difficulty is, a lot of people are under the impression that everything that's published in the Western Mail automatically goes online, and that just is not the case at all. And so you will see different things. And of course, the audience for the Western Mail, generally speaking, is a different audience to the audience for Wales Online. And it used to make, and it still does up to a point, a lot of money from advertising. You know, Wales Online, the model there is to get as many page views as possible, which inevitably means that, shall we say, the more down market material is going to be the prevalent content. You're getting into a situation where those reporters who are employed are not, or many of them are not, involved in producing public interest journalism. They are seeking to entertain people with often what is quite superficial material.
So, Hugh, does that political deficit translate into a democratic deficit? And are we beginning to see that change with COVID and how the UK have recognised those differences among the UK nations?
It's taken a pandemic to get those sort of national titles to recognise the evolution. But you have to realise with those titles, their audience, their main audience is England. You know, 85% of the UK population is in England. So for them, you can imagine is that, oh God, we've got to rewrite a bit of this just to sort of suit Wales and Scotland, because it's creating more work. And I think that's why it is different. It's just labelling it, you know, because if you're talking about health now, you have to talk about health as Welsh news, English news, or Scottish news, because it's different in each of those nations. But I think, you know, with the lead up to the election, I think it's going to be interesting. I think people are more engaged in politics. I think there's a need for a national conversation. You know, how do you facilitate that conversation without it just being sort of people tweeting in echo chambers? And I think that's the other thing, you know, I find as well is, you know, there's chasing audiences and, you know, and numbers and stuff. You know, for me, that's not important. The only thing I'm concerned about in developing our news service is our number of subscribers. It's not the number of people who click through and things like that. And that's the difference. And I think it's, if you've been offering something for free, and I think that's the problem with lots of these services, they offer something for free, expecting people to pay for it afterwards is difficult. So that's why, you know, we're upfront saying, you know, a lot of our content will be free, but, you know, it's a subscription model to have access to all that content. You know, it has to be paid for, but making people realize that there's a value in it and that they feel they've got ownership and an investment in it. And I think that's where being a startup is actually hugely beneficial. But it'll all come down to the quality of the service, because I think what we're looking at is quality over quantity. I think that's the other thing, is because some models depend on clicks and numbers, is they're just churning out a lot of content. So, you know, you'll find articles, somebody said something on Twitter, and somebody on Twitter replied by saying this on Twitter, and that's now being passed as journalism. It's just there in order to get people to click and get them angry and get them to tweet about whatever that was tweeted about. So I think that's where we hope to be different, is to have that quality, but make people realise that, you know, the more people who subscribe, the better our service will become. You know, we can cover, you know, beyond politics. We want to look at business and economics. We want to look at the environment and rural affairs. We want to look at arts and culture. You know, some of those subjects aren't things that you're going to get huge clicks for. So it needs investing in. People need to realise there's a value in it.
Just so you all know, that the Hiraeth model is to charge guests. Rhian, do you want to just mention how you see this from the other end of the M4? How is Wales? Has it changed at all during the COVID pandemic in the UK media, the media in London?
The big thing was Wales is going ahead with the lockdown around November when England was hesitating, which might have been, you know, sort of decisive in how Wales is dealing with the pandemic. So there was, I think people took notice of that, and that helped to establish Wales as a country that could actually exercise autonomy in some areas. But I don't know if that's going to be like a permanent change or particularly significant in the long run. I think Wales still needs to sort of distinguish itself more within the UK press, and more attention and representation needs to be given to it.
On that point, Rhian, so at the beginning of devolution, there was a big attempt by a lot of the London-based UK papers to focus more on Wales, and over the years that's been drawn back. Do you think that's indicative of an absence of interest in Welsh politics from the Welsh people, or a lack of interest in Welsh politics from London papers?
I think it's definitely the latter. I mean, just from what I see, it feels slightly odd to sort of use Twitter as a positive example of anything, but the political discussion that I see happening on Twitter from Welsh people would indicate that there's interest, and there's actually a fairly wide knowledge base, or at least a basis of opinion on there. So I think people are interested in the political potential of Wales. I think something that has become significant recently is the debate on independence, and the way that that's being had perhaps more on social media than it is actually in the Welsh press or within the political class in Wales. So I think that's indicative of Welsh people sort of searching for some way to deal with the flaws of devolution that doesn't involve bowing to sort of right-wing calls to hand power back to Westminster. Like there's a yearning for something that is just a plan and some form of action, I think. I mean, it reminds me of the build up to Brexit in some way, that there was just this. I think independence can be a bit of a chimera sometimes, whereas everyone sort of hangs their hopes on it because it will change something and it'll be something different, but then they don't actually know what the landing ground will look like. But that's just one example. I think there is Welsh people are definitely interested in politics and in talking about it, I think, and it would be good to have some sort of political platform for that, some sort of cohesive, like Wales-wide platform.
I think the thing is that you have to realise that these media organisations are very cynical. If people carry on buying the Daily Mail, and the Daily Mail isn't providing any news coverage at all, or barely at all, about Wales, and particularly about Welsh politics, they are not going to be stepping forward to provide such coverage. They're interested in selling newspapers, and while people continue to buy it because they like the other elements of it, they like the sensational stories about Boris or whatever, in the way that the Daily Mail does what it does, they are not going to take an interest in Wales. That's the difficulty. But a lot of people, frankly, are not that bothered, or they haven't been until very recently. And what has changed very recently is, as we all know, the pandemic. So whether that's going to have a lasting impact afterwards, I wonder. I mean, it may just be that people are particularly interested in what's going on now because the First Minister of Wales and the Welsh government are in a position where they can really tell people how to live their lives. And so that you can't really imagine anything more direct than that in terms of relationship between the rulers and the ruled. Now, once the pandemic is over, once the vaccine's been rolled out, are we just going to revert to the status quo ante, or will people continue to take more of an interest in Welsh politics? I think that remains to be seen.
Do you think there would be any value in trying to get Welsh versions of paper like the Mirror or the Times or anything? Or do you think it has to be sort of grassroots, or not even necessarily grassroots, but it has to be Welsh indigenous media increases this take-up of news?
Well, I think definitely that's the whole point of what we're trying to create. Is it's quite refreshing being able to write about Wales and using the word North without having to say North Wales, because we know that we're talking about Wales. We don't refer to anything. We won't refer to things within Wales, because if you're in Wales, you know where these places are. And I think that's the key thing, is giving that identity. Everything we do has to be done from a Welsh perspective, because whatever those papers do from the UK point of view, they've realised that they haven't. It's not worth their while financially to create those editorially, those Welsh versions of the papers. Like I say, the Mirror tried it for a bit, and they didn't have that impact. So if they're selling what they're selling now, why bother? But I think in the long term, I think what Martin said was true. I think there has been an awakening from a politics point of view because of COVID, and people are actually more aware now of what governments do or what governments don't do. And I think that will change things. But I think the other key thing when we're talking about news coverage is audiences. We've got a younger generation now who are digital natives, who don't buy newspapers. It's never been part of their reasoning, of their understanding of stuff. They might pick it up if there's a copy in the house. But they're used to getting their content digitally, and they're also used to getting their content in different styles. And I think that's the key thing, is creating content that's relatable from the audience as well. It's not a one shoe fits all now, and I think that's the problem with print. Print is going down, but I know talking to some publishers, so casual sales of papers have gone down because people just aren't going out as much as they were. But people, there are some papers that that are sold, via subscription, with paper boys, paper girls taking out, and those numbers have gone up. So there is a demand for print, but I think print needs to be more flexible as well. I think there's a danger if you're doing something on a daily basis, you've got 48 pages to fill every day, and it's a slog to do that. Whereas maybe it's a case of having weeklies, or papers that coincide with specific events. So hopefully with the election, if it happens in May, we'll be publishing a national daily print version of the paper in the week of the election, and in the aftermath, looking at the results and the fallout from what happens there. But I think we need to realise that younger people consume things differently, because they know they'll pay for Netflix, they'll pay for Apple Music, they're paying for Spotify. So the fact that I think it's my generation were the ones who were more keen on sort of getting dodgy stuff off the internet for free when we could, when we could. But because security's tightened up and people aren't able to do it now, I think we've got a generation now who, if you've got the product and the offer is there and the price point is right, then they will do it. But also, hopefully, you'll get older people who will want to invest in something in order to ensure that younger people do have access to news that's originated in Wales and comes from those communities all across Wales.
Rhian, where do you think the growth market is then for journalism? Do you think it's in digital journalism? Do you think it's in audio mediums? Do you think it's in visual journalism? What do you think?
There's room for growth in all these areas, apart from I was going to say apart from print, but again, as Hugh was saying, I think even print might be able to at least sustain itself, if not grow, by sort of diversifying what it does. We can even ask, broader questions about what is what is the purpose of news? What do we actually want from news as readers, as punters, you know, as well as media workers? Like, and the idea of having maybe less quantity of news but better context. One growth area could be offering historical context, understanding of what's been reported, how present events connect to the past, that kind of thing, how geopolitics sort of is all connected through national and global economies and things like that. I think the thing to keep in mind when thinking about diversifying and growth markets is be responsive to what your readers want, and what potential readers might want. We're trying various different things at Red Pepper at the moment, sort of switching from just being a quarterly journal to having a regular newsletter, which is briefer, but you're in contact with the readers more on things like live streaming, panel events and that kind of thing. So there's all, I think all these different methods of engagement can be used to grow media that exists and to start new outlets, I think.
We've all mentioned, or you've all mentioned Scotland at one time or another this evening. Like, how is Scotland perceived in London? Is it in a different category altogether to Wales?
I feel like it is. Whether that's due to Scotland having joined the Union later than Wales did, if it's as simple as that, I don't know. But I think Scotland has a distinct sense of itself. It has, as you were saying, a more Scottish sort of media landscape. The SNP obviously are providing an electoral alternative in a way that I don't think Plaid are. What underlies that? I don't know. Even is it just that Scotland is bigger than Wales is? I don't know, but it does seem to be accorded more respect in England than Wales is.
Of course, Scotland has had a tradition of more diverse media. It's the case that most of the London-based papers have editions specifically for Scotland. There are also, of course, papers produced for the Scottish market from within Scotland. So there are quite a few newspapers on a daily basis to choose from. And I think that actually is very healthy, because then you get people on one paper wanting to follow up stories from another one, get a new angle. Whereas in Wales, there's very little competition, or there has been very little competition. Quite a few years ago, just a little anecdote here, but within living memory, I was covering a Plaid Cymru conference in Llandudno, and after the day, and after everyone had filed their copy, then all the journalists, or the vast majority of the journalists, went out for a curry. I ended up in a curry house in Llandudno with 20 people from the BBC, not all of whom were journalists, some of them were technicians, but that was it. I mean, that was a real contrast to the situation in Scotland. The point is that the reason why the English media takes notice of Scotland is because there is a very real threat of Scottish independence. In Northern Ireland, they take interest in what's going on there because there is always the threat of a recurrence of terrorism. Wales, what can we threaten them with? Not very much. And we don't have many MPs to create disruption or to actually have much of an impact in the House of Commons. So that's why we always lose out in terms of having any kind of leverage.
Hugh, do you think that this increased Welsh media landscape should be supported by the Welsh government? Or do you think it needs to come from the private sector? And do you think that it's in the Welsh government's interest to have more scrutiny of its actions?
Oh, hugely. I think that's I doubt that you'd find many politicians in Wales who would say that they don't want more scrutiny or more attention. I think that attitude, if it was negative before, it wouldn't be now, because they know that the institution is potentially under threat because people don't understand what they're doing there. So I think, yeah, definitely, I think from that point of view, it's vital that the stuff comes out there. Martin mentioned it because, if you went down to the Senedd, there would have been a few journalists there, embedded, but I don't know how many journalists are based in the Senedd now. There's probably under a handful. And I think, the Welsh government are keen to get, content out. And they, funnily enough, in the launch of the IWA Media Summit this morning, one of the things that Creative Wales mentioned, because obviously they're the body that looks after the creative industries, and news and journalism comes under that, was during COVID, the subject that they were contacted about more than anything else was news in Wales and journalism and local journalism. And I believe that in the process now of putting together some sort of support that'll be open for people to bid for in the coming few weeks. And I think that it is vital. In the short term, it costs too much to employ somebody if you haven't got the revenues coming in. So while you build up those revenues, then any financial support that would allow you to employ more people. And I think that's what's key. I think at the end of the day, we want to see more people employed, and I think we can use digital technology. We look at automation. Then there's a danger you use that to lose people. Well, how do you flip that around? How can you use digital technology in order to allow journalists to do more journalism, to use them as tools to help them, so we can have more journalists, more people actually delivering that content. And I think that's my intention in the long term, is you want to be able to grow a business that can employ people. I think that's important as well in Wales, that is creating jobs.
Certainly in the Welsh Government's interest to have more scrutiny. I mean, it may well not be in the interests of individual politicians, depending on what they've done in office. But certainly, the government as an institution will benefit from accountability, transparency, and scrutiny that journalism should provide. And in a more positive sense as well, the government needs to be able to communicate to the public the work that it's doing, as well as this sort of democratic mandate that it has to support journalism as an industry and to support local jobs through it as well.
Martin, in all the time you've been examining the Welsh political system, do you think that the political class and the public are now more aware than they ever have been about the need for more Wales-specific media?
Well, as someone who, in my NUJ capacity, has given evidence to a succession of inquiries at the Senedd over the years, what I have found is that there has been, quite a bit of hand-wringing, quite a lot of expression of concern, quite a lot of sympathy for the difficulties that journalists work under. But when it has come to the crunch, there hasn't been an enormous amount of investment. In the last couple of years, it's fair to say that the Welsh Government has provided some money for microsites, but I think more needs to be done. It's for long been the case in Wales that Welsh language media has received public subsidy. So why shouldn't English language media get the same sort of attention? And I really think that there is now a greater understanding of the fact that the crisis has been going on for a long time, and it's just going to get worse. And as the Senedd has accrued more powers, the circulations of newspapers have gone down and down and down, and the coverage has inevitably decreased. So something does have to be done, and I very much hope that in the new term, hopefully after May, some serious consideration will be given to how that may be possible. There have to be some arm's length kind of operation, because you wouldn't have a situation where politicians were directly funding their own favourite publications. But something has to be sorted out.
On that note, I want to say thank you all very much for coming on this evening. It's been great to talk to you all. If someone wanted to find you on Twitter, where would they go? Rhian?
I am just Rhian E. Jones on Twitter.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Hugh?
Hugh Mar, Huwmar.
Yeah. And Martin?
At Shipton Martin.
Wonderful, thank you very much. If you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find us on Medium at HiraethBlogCymru, on Facebook at HiraethBlogCymru, and on Twitter at HiraethBlog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.